Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Fuller. I'm a research associate professor at UNC and part of the Education Policy Initiative at Carolina. And I am presenting on behalf of our team, which is a partnership between EPIC and partners at NCDPI, who I see several of on the call as well. Can you go to the next slide? And maybe the slide after that. The agenda is not that exciting. So as I said, this was work with NCDPI. It started out as a partnership with the Office of Learning and Research, which was originally the Office of Learning Recovery. But NCDPI has since reorganized. And so while our partners are still there, they're in different offices now. But our study was focused on sort of two main areas. One is just understanding kind of overall pandemic impacts on student outcomes and how those evolved over time. Given the other ongoing work nationwide, as well as other ongoing work in North Carolina that was really focused on test scores, we focused largely on non-test score outcomes to like understand how kind of this broader set of outcomes were developing over time. And then the other major focus was on studying the impact of school extension programs that were sponsored by the OLR using some of the state's ESSER funding to impact student recovery. Next slide. And so when I say school extension programs, what does that mean? Well, there were actually 4 programs that we've been studying. The first was in the summer of 2021, which was a legislatively mandated, fairly long, academically oriented summer program for at-risk students. Then in summer 22, 23, and 24, we also had summer programs, but they were different. They're just oriented differently. And we're typically shorter. Summer bridge programs were a little bit of a mix. Some were focused on transitional grades and transitioning students to the next grade level. Some were sort of more broadly focused summer school programs. And then we had career accelerator programs, which were specifically for middle and high schoolers, and focused on career and technical education, getting students to do hands-on exposure to some of the CTE areas that exist in their districts. And then the 4th program was actually an after-school program that took place in the 22-23 and 23-24 school year, originally for math specifically, but later expanded to all subjects in middle grades to provide additional learning support for students. So, and so within these focus areas, like our main questions were, how has the pandemic affected student learning, engagement, and progress through school? I want you to note that sort of broader focus, not just test scores, but other outcomes for students. How were these school extension activities implemented, and what were the impacts on, again, these broader set of outcomes, which, we have sort of how we've measured, some of these pieces across the grant there. We go to the next slide. So then diving into what we've learned. Well, some of this is going to sound familiar because we started learning it a while ago, and hopefully as have others, and it's been kind of circulating out there, but we all kind of know at this point that the initial impacts of the pandemic were quite large and also uneven. We saw really dramatic increases in absences, as well as reductions in grades and increases in course failure and grade repetition. That graph on the right is looking at the percent of students that were retained in grade in the 2020-21 school year, which if you look at that high school bar, is pretty startlingly high. And we saw that students in historically marginalized groups definitely saw the biggest initial impacts to the pandemic. Next slide. And then as things have kind of moved forward, one thing that has stood out is that recovery in one area hasn't necessarily meant recovery across the board. We've seen very different patterns as we've looked at different outcomes for students. There's that familiar pattern with test scores of the recovery and then sort of slowing and plateauing. With grades, we saw grades bounce back really almost immediately in the 2021-22 school year and kind of remain similar to pre-pandemic levels. But, fairly early on, we started to notice the same was not true with absences, which continued to worsen as students return to school and have remained very elevated. That graph on the right, which I forgot to put a title on, is showing the percent of students who are chronically absent in each year since the pandemic compared to 2019. And it hasn't returned anywhere close to baseline. And we've been looking across sort of the broader range of absences. There can be all this focus on chronic absenteeism, but when you look across the broader range, this isn't just students at the top end. We're actually seeing that all across the distribution, students are absent more. Even if you look down at the very left end of that distribution, you'll see that there are very few perfect attenders anymore. And so, this is sort of an area of concern. We've seen recovery in some places. Some things seem to be back on track, and then the other things aren't. And so understanding that, I think, is a big puzzle that, that we're all continuing to work on. Next slide. And then, turning to these programs that were intended to help students get back on track, to intervene in some of these impacts that we saw. So the summer programs that we studied primarily served at-risk students. This is particularly true for the more academically oriented programs. The Career Accelerator is a little bit different, and students were a little bit more kind of middle of the road in terms of their prior performance. But in spite of the fact that these are intended to serve at-risk students and students who have fallen behind academically, the evidence of impacts on test scores were very limited. We did, however, see that there are some benefits in other areas. So for high schoolers who participated in recovery after that first summer after the online year, we did see that a lot of students, in fact, did recover course credit and continue to maintain those credits as they move forward. We also saw that those students were less likely to drop out. For students who participated in these CTE-oriented summer programs, we did see an increase in high schoolers who did participate in these programs going on to take CTE courses, but we didn't see the test score gains that we might hope for. And, this is perhaps not terribly surprising when you consider summer programs are relatively short compared to the course of an entire school year. And so the challenge there of moving the needle on those academic impacts can be substantial. Moving to the next slide. One thing we have seen really consistently, however, across all of these different programs, all of these different kinds of time investments in these students is evidence of improved engagement. We see that most clearly quantitatively in our absences, where we see that these students, even compared to similar students in their schools and districts, went on to have more days in attendance and to be less likely to be chronically absent in the subsequent school year than their peers, which in this landscape of increased absenteeism, this feels like a win. We also, we did surveys and interviews with staff members, and so we also heard a lot of reports of these same kinds of engagement outcomes. I know we all wish that we had better measures of engagement beyond absences, and we don't always have those, in a statewide administrative data set, but what we heard from a lot of the people who were part of these programs were these engagement-oriented stories about positive relationships built between students and staff, between students and their peers, students transitioning to the next grade in school, whether that's 6th grade or 9th grade, more smoothly, as well as just like a level of excitement for the kinds of hands-on activities that these programs are able to offer. And sort of as we have continued to see this story emerge, one thing that this has pointed us to is, as we think about these kinds of programs, particularly summer programs, being realistic about what are our goals of the programs. Is a 3-week program really intended to create large impacts on test scores, academic gains, or is a goal around building excitement, engagement with school, smoothing transitions, experiencing an introduction to career technical education, these engagement-oriented goals, more realistic? And if those are our primary goals for these programs, how does that inform how these programs are designed? So next slide. So we have this sort of planning for the future orientation. We've been talking for the last couple of years in the Restart Network about future learning disruptions. Well, in North Carolina, the future is now, or perhaps rather last September, when Hurricane Helene devastated the western part of the state. I have no doubt you all saw the news coverage on that. So, I probably don't have to tell you that this was a very unprecedented event, and many of our school districts ended up missing multiple weeks of school. Many pivoted back to online remote education, hopefully now with substantially more resources than they had back in 2020. And we know a lot more now about how students experience learning disruptions of this type. So some of those lessons learned that we, as researchers and as we've seen our State Department respond to this, have, been able to take some of those lessons and apply them in this new situation. We know more now the need to pay attention to multiple outcomes. Test scores are not the whole story, and by paying attention to sort of a broader range of outcomes, we can better respond to what students need. We also know that recovery is challenging and it can be uneven. And so making sure that we're really thinking about which students are struggling and in what areas as we are moving forward from this storm is important. And we know that engagement is important, and we know it took a really big hit during the pandemic, and we don't want to see that those kinds of patterns recurring as we're experiencing these new learning disruptions. And EPIC is currently partnering to study new summer programs that took place this summer, modeled on some of those post-COVID programs in the western part of the state. And this is giving us an opportunity to take some of the things that, you reach the end of a project and you know what you should have done at the beginning to have exactly the data you wanted to, learn the questions that came up along the way. And so we're having an opportunity now to do that and have invested a lot of time in trying to get detailed information on what did the districts do in these programs. Program on paper, two programs on paper can look the same, but in implementation can actually look quite different. And so we're excited to, put some of that to work to answer some of the lingering questions that we still have about some of the summer programs we've been studying. Next slide. All right, and then connections with the field. Well, in addition to this new work on Hurricane Helene that we're engaged with, we're also continuing, like many others, to look at this ongoing problem of absenteeism. We know that there's lots of people in places who seem to be eager to kind of turn the page on pandemic recovery and, kind of declare us recovered and move on. But we also know that things don't look exactly like they did in previous decades. Whether we declare ourselves recovered or not, we're not in exactly this. Things look different. Some things have changed, and we need to understand better where we are now, and which things are different so that we can respond to those and serve the students that we have now. And so, we're engaged in work to kind of try to make sense of that and think about what is going on here that is so different in terms of attendance, and what does it tell us about what students and families need that's different than what they needed 6 years ago now. So we're still engaged with that. And then also we've learned a lot about the power of partnership, and I think we've learned a lot of ways that we can partner different. We had worked with CDPI on a number of projects over a number of years prior to this, but the ways that we work together, I think, evolved during the pandemic. For one thing, I think when we think about pandemic, the urgency of research and that need for rapid response research became really obvious. As university researchers, it's really easy to feel most comfortable waiting until you have peer review on everything before you put it out there because you don't want to dare be wrong about something. But it turns out that policymakers and practitioners have to make decisions well before the publication cycle completes. And so finding ways to be engaged, we've been meeting monthly, still meeting monthly, to talk about what are kind of the urgent priorities, what are the questions, how can we best disseminate what we know now are, the best answers we can provide, even if they're not the absolute perfect answers. And I think that that has been helpful and something that, we aim to continue in our partnership with NCDPI and all of our partnerships with policymakers and practitioners. And then just sort of a reality here that we have that buzzword of evidence-based policy, but that requires that policymakers actually have evidence, and there's not always perfect evidence. There's not always a perfect, natural experiment or instrumental variable, or the things that we as researchers would love to have perfect causal evidence. And so thinking really carefully about how can we provide the evidence, the best evidence we can on the timeline that it's actually needed for decision making is something I think that we have been getting better at and continuing with as we come out of the pandemic, and maybe everything doesn't feel quite as urgent, but decisions still are taking place now.